All right. So today I'm speaking to somebody who is actually one of the people that I've been thinking so many questions to ask her, and it's like, where do we start? So let's start at the usual question, which I ask all my podcast guests, which is a very simple question of who are you?
It's not that simple, really, is it? As that you stole that for me. That's what I normally ask my clients.
Okay. Well, now that the tables have shifted.
Yeah. I don't like labels, really, but to give you an idea really about what my work is about, the best way I can describe myself, I suppose, is an adventurer and a trailblazer of the mind and the brain and the future, really. So, if you want to get technical, people can see my titles in your information. But I like to call myself many things, but I try and call myself those things that will reflect the essence of my work. So for me, I do a lot of work around cognitive behavior and psychology, lifestyle, wellness. I am a futurologist because I can see trends before they even happen. I can see the directionality of where we are heading, even though we might not consciously acknowledge that. So I look at a lot of trends. I look at how technology is affecting behaviors, independently, individually, but as well what that ripples out into the world. So I'm in the middle of writing a book at the moment, like so I'm an author, I'm a futurologist. I'm also a core project manager for Conversational AI with a Canadian tech startup based over in Toronto, where we're looking at the next generation of chatbots for mental health. So, and I'm a part-time guest lecturer, or I haven't done anything for about a year, but I was doing quite a few guest lectures at the University of Continuing Education at Cambridge around some of these topics as well. I'm a yoga teacher. I've been a yoga teacher for almost 2 decades. I'm an academic. And for me, I see myself as how can I say this? As a mediator between both of those paradigms. So I sit in the middle of the esoterical teachings and philosophies and practices and Western science and technology. I think that sort of sums it up.
Fantastic. I'm so glad to be speaking to somebody whose introduction can go on for so long in terms of both what you do and what you have done and what you're interested in. And so one of the things that is a challenge in some sense with tools like LinkedIn, everyone talks about you got to introduce yourself with a specific thing that you do. Like, for example, I optimize marketing for 6-figure entrepreneurs. And that's it. It's like, to me, that always sounds so myopic, so specific, and really increasingly not value adding. Tell me a little bit about how do you think about integration of all these different fields, and what is the kind of point in that?
Yeah, sure. So I was doing a podcast last week, and I got asked the same question. Well, we had a conversation around that. And for me, I just naturally made the connections as I was going through my own journey. So I just to give you some sort of landscape here with what the question that you just asked. So, I was working in a non-yoga environment for many years. I had a corporate job. I had a burnout. I found yoga. It healed me. And that was the first catalyst. And it was more about my mind than my body. But what I came to realize was that my body is shut down because my mind and my body weren't connecting. So that's why I got into yoga, first of all. I then saw how incredibly healing that could be. And I was fascinated by the philosophies behind these different Eastern practices and teachings. So I've always been interested in the mind. My dad was very interested in the mind as well. And that's something naturally that I've just always found fascinating, the mind and human behavior. And then really it was a natural progression. So this is sort of coming around to answering your question, is that for me, you know, when you look at yoga, it yokes the body and the mind, you know, brings it back together so it can operate in a functional, optimum manner. That's the whole purpose of yoga. You know, nowadays, unfortunately, it's got a bit lost with people flying around on one hand and running around in bikinis on Instagram, and, you know, everyone's like a superstar yoga teacher. But put all of that aside and get back to the roots. You know, it's a healing modality. It's a discipline. It's a disciplined modality, and it's a healing modality. And then for me, when I was training and I was teaching yoga, I took a coaching course with Elena Brower and the Handle Group in New York. And she had tailor-made a course for about a year, it was, around coaching yoga teachers and with all the things that we have to deal with as yoga teachers, because you know, the mental health of yoga teachers isn't really spoken about in today's society, and yet we're not frontline workers, but we are healing and helping people, and that needs to be more recognized. And actually, funnily enough, just slightly going off your question just for a moment, I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with somebody that asked me to get involved with the Yoga Teachers Union. I didn't even know we had one, or there's one being birthed because of what COVID-19 has thrown up, and how certain studios are behaving and not behaving in a manner which is relative to what they're selling, and how a lot of yoga teachers are having breakdowns and worries about money because suddenly their income is gone, and all they've done is give to students and studios, and the giving and receiving hasn't been mutual. So a lot of teachers are getting, a lot of healers and a lot of teachers are, it's like the harsh light of day has dawned on a lot of people. So slightly going off cue there, sorry, but so, you know, when we look at the mind and the body, it's not just non-yoga teachers, it's yoga teachers, it's everybody, right? So, you know, the yoga for me was a springboard towards coaching, and then looking at the mind and behavior more in depth with coaching. And then during that process, unfortunately, my mum contracted dementia, and which inevitably turned into Alzheimer's, which she suffered with for like 9 years. And I was using the practices of yoga for me to help deal with going through that journey, which was incredibly beneficial. So I could be there for my mum, but I actually wanted to understand what was going on in her brain. So then at the ripe old age of 48, 49, I decided to go back to university, like you do, to study like cognitive psychology and neuroscience. I needed to understand what was going on, because I was going through an experience where that would be beneficial for me to know. But going back to your original question, and this whole journey, that I've just sort of summarized, it's a journey of 20 years, but I'll try to summarize it in a few minutes. During that time, what I started to see was there was a lot of insights and similarities between what the East was saying about us as entities, as human beings, and what the West was saying. But until up to that point, it was, you know, you had to look at behavior either, you know, through academia and science, or you looked at it through the fluffiness of the East. And I'm not saying that in a disrespectful way, but as you know, there's a lot of people out there saying a lot of fluffy things that aren't substantiated. And whilst I understand, and I talk about this a lot in my classes, our explicit and our implicit nature. However, when we're looking at the implicit, we don't want to go so far out there that we that we lose ourselves. About ground, it's really important that it's time for people to ground. So, we need to see both sides, the implicit and the explicit. And I guess for me, the East and the West represent those two modalities. I think there's nothing that can be achieved really from looking at human behavior through one lens. I just don't see that as beneficial for where we are as a society. I think that it would suit us much better to look at human behavior, mental health, physical health, through all these different lenses, like spirituality, science, philosophy, technology, and especially through AI, because for me, AI, I have a love-hate relationship with it, and that's another conversation for another time. But AI is vastly misunderstood by the majority of people. Automation is vastly misunderstood. AI and automation are not the same thing. Artificial intelligence is split into different arenas. What we're dealing with at the moment is artificial narrow intelligence through what we're doing right now, through our Alexa, through our Google. But I'm always looking ahead, and because I work with tech and tech engineers and and AI engineers and coders, I'm looking at what's coming, what's trending, where the investment is coming, what people are wanting to do, why they're wanting to do it. So I think that AI may give us another opportunity to explore the question of who we are and why we're trying to create an intelligence that's greater than us, and why do we as humans have a fascination with beings that are supernatural or of a higher intelligence, and what does that say about us? Does that say that we need to be led by something else? And does that therefore reflect that we're all just puppets on a string, that we're all part of a greater complexity, like it was depicted over 20 years ago in The Matrix? I find it very interesting now that they're remaking Matrix 4 before the shutdown. Mm-hmm. So that says a lot about society. It says that people have some people, not everyone, some people have a greater interest, and they can start to see some underlying connections between what we thought we were, what we are, and what we're going to become next, and what we're going to become next because of the influence of technology. So I think that in order to get to that deeper understanding, we have to, like you said, we have to draw all these connections in, because that's the only way that we can really understand who we are and where we're going next. If that does that answer your question?
It answers the question very nicely, and I'm glad that it kind of reconciles with both my thinking and thinking from other people who've been in these kind of multiple modalities. I speak a lot to people who are, let's say, management consulting professionals who are extremely spiritual, and people who are, for example, user experience designers who wrote books like Customer Experiences with Soul. So these kind of notions and topics are coming into modern day capitalism as an integral part, because we are starting to realize that mind and soul and spirit and all these kind of things are perhaps our only, if that's the way to say it, differentiators from a piece of tech, I don't know, phone, right?
Yeah.
And things like that. But even that phone might eventually have some sort of a soul, and that's an interesting topic, perhaps, to also discuss at some other point. So how do you? What is the role, for example, of spirituality in technology?
Well, that's an interesting question, and there's a couple of different ways of answering that, and a couple of different ways of looking at that from my perspective. I guess, like, from a softer perspective, when we look at spirituality, we look at the teachings of various esoterical practices around compassion and empathy. So I think, we can bring those facets into it. If we really look at traditions from the East, especially in Taoism, if we look towards Chinese, Japanese mythologies, even if we look towards Hinduism, just sort of going back to what we were talking about, just touching on that, when we look at all the gods and deities from all the different religions, right, we class them as having superpowers, or we class them as having a higher intelligence. So then we're talking thousands of years back, right? So if we that just shows me, from a behavioral point of view, that we've been molded into a sense where we do see ourselves as intelligent, but we have this ongoing battle to prove it, because we have the influence of some of these deities and gods. This is just my take on it. It won't be everybody's, but obviously we're just having an open discussion. So again, we're talking about connections. So when we look at, I think when I sent you some information, it's so interesting because aspects of spirituality remind us the importance of connecting to nature, or our natural spirit, right, or soul, or whatever you want to call it, that which is implicit, that we don't really know exists, but at the same time it has to. And some would say, well, does it? Or is it just really clever programming from a greater entity? So if we look at Taoism, there's a real connection there between, and especially if you look at Japanese culture right across the board. I mean, there's been loads of programs over the last 2 years on this, how they are integrating robotics and AI into their households and into everyday life, because they see it as the same. And in Taoism, it is all about, there's a lot around AI and machines and humans being seen as one, as a source of connectiveness. So I think when you look at particular Judaism, when you look at Judaism and Taoism, there are a lot of references. In Judaism, there's the golem, which was created, which was this shell pre-soul. So already going back thousands of years, we start to see how our fascination with creating or believing in another, or the necessity to believe in another intelligence, was already brewing. I mean, it's nothing new. It's just, I think some people are waking up. If you go to the Kundalini tradition, Yogi Bhajan always said, this is the awakening, this is the era of awakening. Machinery, technology, but a greater sense of awakening to our environment, our ecology, our physiology, where we fit, how we fit. I'm really answering that in a very transparent, honest way, because I feel up to this point, and COVID for me really represents that, COVID's shaken everything we thought we knew, that we wanted to be like or needed, suddenly completely shaken, turned upside down. And it's shown a lot of cracks, but it's also helped a lot of people see how they've become stuck, and how they've just been agreeable to certain paradigms or institutions. And suddenly people are waking, there's a lot of people that have died, I know, and that's the horrible side of this. But I think we always have to get through it. We always have to look at the positives and the negatives. I don't just believe in looking at the positives, but I believe that you have to find positives within the negatives. And I think this has been a huge teaching lesson for those that have really woken up and have done what we've been requested to do. And as a result of that, have had more time with their families, have understood the simplicity, how important it is to get back to values. Spirituality is all about values. The modern day therapies and modalities I use, action and commitment therapy, is a value-based modality. So it's getting people back to basics, which is what we've been asked to do through this whole pandemic, is to really, sit with the basics, operate with basics. And surprisingly, people, at first, well, I can't do that, I can't do that. And now a lot of people I talk to are loving it. Obviously not those people that are in high-rise blocks of flats that obviously can't get outside. But, again, it's always going to affect certain proportions of the population in a different way. But in general, when I've spoken to people, they feel that they've had, that it's just showing them what they need to attend to. So I think spirituality really fits into the human psyche, and you don't necessarily have to call it spirituality. You can just call it awareness. A lot of people have a stigma around spirituality. So I think we can take a lot of information from the old teachings of spirituality, and we might see how they are relevant to the technology that we're trying to create. And also when we look back at spirituality, we can see the warnings, like in Judaism and the stuff around the golem. There was a lot of how can I say this, this apocalyptic feeling around that. There were warnings written through their teachings about going too far, and it comes back to what I was saying to you before. Just because we should, just because we can doesn't mean we should. Just because we can do all of this stuff doesn't mean that we should do it. And if we are going to continue on this trajectory of trying to create a higher intelligence, do we really understand what that means and how it's going to impact? So I think there's a lot of interesting information from, like I say, from different aspects of spirituality, especially Taoism and Judaism. Even if you're not religious, it's very interesting looking at their texts and some of the information from their narrative, because for me, it's a straight crossover into what we do need to be thinking about.
Yeah, I find that there's a lot of just basically with technology, what we're doing at any point in time is biomimicking nature, but also increasingly biomimicking ancient wisdom texts and just turning it into more materialistic, practical, procedural set of tooling, effectively, that may or may not help us actually understand ourselves better. And that, I think it's been useful to be watching the Black Mirror series on Netflix for me to kind of see some of the potential anti-patterns that can arise through this process. Salema, are you familiar with spiral dynamics and integral theory?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So one of the things that I've been conversing about with my friend Tommy, and integral theory is one of the theories of everything that looks to integrate all theories.
So it's like consilience then, basically.
I'm not sure about.
There was a book written. There was a book, I can't remember the author. I think I mentioned it in one of my previous podcasts, called Consilience, and it's the integration of all these avenues of thought.
Yes.
It's written by Wilson. That's it. Yeah, it's written by Wilson. Consilience. It's Consilience. It's. I think it was written quite a few years ago, but he was probably one of the first people to actually speak about the essence of what you're talking about and what we're talking about as well.
So integral theory would be like one form of that kind of thinking, but basically it integrates spirituality, psychology, philosophy, sciences, religious thinking, and all that stuff. And spiral dynamics talks about 8 levels of human awareness, going from instinctive all the way to holistic and cosmocentric. But one of the interesting things that's been put forward by the author of Integral Theory, Ken Wilber, is because he's been doing a lot of meditation and things like that. And as we do that kind of contemplative meditation, introspective meditation, we can kind of strip off the layers of the onion, as Alan Watts spoke about it. And eventually, as you peel off the layers of the onion, you find in the middle that there is nothing. There is no kind of core per se. But then Ken Wilber spoke about it as the I amness. Okay. But so, and then at one point he said, there is the I amness before the Big Bang, like you existed even before the universe existed. Like, so this is a kind of potentially what I was aiming at when I asked you, who are you originally? So if I re-ask you that question of who are you, when you peel off all these layers of, you know, body, even mind, because someone like Sadhguru would, in his practice of inner engineering, would say, I'm not my body, I'm not even my mind. So if we take away the body and mind, who are we?
We're just energy. We're energy, we're atoms, we're like tiny, you know, and this is what I'm saying, we're like not even the tip of a fingertip in a greater complexity. So, you know, in yoga, we talk about stripping away those layers as the koshas, you know, so you're peeling the onion. So fundamentally, at the end of the day, from a quantum physics perspective, we are just all energy in this universe. And I think that makes that goes back and makes sense of what some of these old religious texts talk about. So, you know, when we create AI, there is energy. It's code, but isn't code energy? Because surely you need something to drive the code.
So somebody asked me recently, because there's also this other question around what is real, and you're also a psychologist. So, you know, in integral theory, they'll talk about 4 quadrants, and these 4 quadrants are derived from all languages around the world that speak about essentially 4 aspects, which is I, my singular inner space. Then the we, which is our plural inner space. Then there is the it, which is individual objects, like objectified, singular, external, and its, which is objectified, plural, external. So there's like 4 types of reality of I, we, it, and its. And all those are real, but really to get to full integrity and full realization of what is truly real with a capital R, you got to combine all 4 of them, I, we, it, and its, and they all have to kind of check out and reconcile. So then there's the question somebody asked the other day, are thoughts real? And you asked whether code is real, because there are these kind of aspects in the universe that are generating what we observe in the observable reality as the real outputs and so on. But as you say, is code real? Well, code is certainly generating something else, but so there's that kind of metaphysics of things, that there is a realm in which codification of everything exists as a blueprint for how then
absolutely. I mean, that is what, you know, that is what sacred geometry is. And in Katona yoga, the method that I teach, it's based around Taoism and the 5 element theory of Chinese medicine. And it talks about the fits, it talks about patterns physiologically in the body, how patterns are code. And for me, I find that's the whole thing, that well, not just Katona yoga, but when I started practicing that method and I started to see the theory behind it, to me, that made a lot more sense. What I would say is, on what you've said, I'm looking at it from a neuroscientific perspective. When I did vision science at university, because I was having this conversation the other day with somebody else that was a forward thinker. Yeah, how do we know what's real? You know, and why is everybody's reality different? And how and what do we actually see? In order to really answer that question, to really strip it back, you have to go back to how vision operates, because vision gives us our perception of the world. Vision gives us the connections. But that, you know, and that's prevalent with how people see things differently. But when we're looking at, like, how do I know that's a water bottle? You know, it's not a simple question, because to look at that, what's going on in the back of my brain, you know, and the signals from my brain to my eyes tells me that's a bottle. But that's only based on my previous experience. So if I didn't have any experience, would that not be a bottle? Would that bottle not even exist? And so for me, I find like the story, the narratives that have, and I tell you what is very interesting. I talk about a lot in my blog posts and when I talk to different people. This narrative behind the Matrix is more relevant now than it's ever been from when it was even first created. I watched that movie, the first movie, once, and I got it straight away, and that was 20 years ago.
So Matrix is actually written by students of integral theory.
So it makes complete sense, because binary, I was having this conversation with my Taylorism teacher last weekend, and we were talking about binary, the ones and the zeros, and the connection to Taoism and Chinese medicine, and how that was prevalent in the Matrix. But going away from the Matrix and to what's currently been on TV, apart from Black Mirror, which is equally as good and provoking. But for me, the real program that is really on point is Westworld, and Westworld 3, series 3, that's just finished. Because in the last series, in the series 3, you know, you're taken from the original concept in the first series of Westworld, and you see the evolution of how the predicament of what happens to a greater intelligence when it starts writing its own code and starts overriding human ethics. And there's and I'm a member of the IEE, which is all about ethics and technology and engineering global, and the World Economic Forum as well. And this is a big topic, the ethics and morals around AI integration into society. Westworld, really, for me, people say, oh, you know, it's really far-fetched. And I'm like, well, we thought that 20 years ago with the Matrix. You know, okay, we're not in a Matrix like that, but we can all resonate to a degree with elements of that. Westworld, for me, in this last series, why it's important for me is there's a classic line in one of the scripts, and it says, humans live according to their code. Humans only live according to their code, which questions free will and consciousness. So when we say humans live according to their code, whose code is it? And so I did a lot of work around free will and consciousness when I was at Cambridge. And one of the persons that I really respect is, God, I can't remember his name now. having a brain freeze, talking too much technology.
Goes to show the names. Yeah.
Daniel Walpert. So Daniel Walpert, he's the head of the Zuckerman Institute for Brain, Mind, Body Behavior in New York, but he was formerly Cambridge and Oxford. And there's this brilliant TED talk that he did back in 2011 where he spoke about the only reason we have a brain. What's the only reason? Why do we have a brain? What's the only reason we have a brain? And because I did computational elements of computational neuroscience, and because I can come from a movement-based background holistically, I then went to the more scientific, mechanical side of what movement is, and how consciousness and free will fit into movement. And it was a very interesting time because my presentation or the lecture that I did was on Lebert, if it is French, his work. He was a French neuroscientist back in the 80s, and he when he did an experiment and he published his paper, it was like people did not like it at all, because he basically said, free will doesn't exist. And a lot of people were saying, well, if it doesn't exist, people will be jumping off buildings and committing suicide. You have to give people something to hold on to. And I find that very interesting from a behavioral point. So if you say to someone, he did the work in the 80s, and then in the 90s and in the 2000s, it was Patrick Haggard of UCL in London. And I studied some of his work, and it was like, yeah, free will and free won't. He was to the conclusion that we don't not have free will, and we don't have free won't. And we sit somewhere in the middle of that again. So it sort of references becoming the mediator and sitting in between those two. So that is just from a more neuroscientific perspective. But I think that's something very interesting to explore when you look at computerized movement, when you go towards robotics and AI, because at the end of the day, AI doesn't actually need a shell to exist. It can exist without being in a shell, and with a shell, it doesn't need to be in a mimic of a human body. Therefore, I find it very interesting. And my question is, are we trying to put it in bodies to make it more acceptable? Is it why do we want to make these human mimics of ourselves that have skin that, and this is the whole thing with Westworld, why are you making these machines so humanoid? What is I find the reason behind it more worrying and more concerning than the actual doing of it. So again, it comes back to this philosophy of, because we can, because we can do it, doesn't mean we should do it. And why are we doing it? So I think that I sort of like binge watched the third series over 3 days. And then I was watching, the husband and wife team that created the project. I was watching them being interviewed, and I was hearing the cast talk about Rachel Evan Wood. She's got a really good take on all of it, and Thandie Newton and all of these people. And it's really interesting because they did like a panel discussion, and it was really interesting seeing actors in their own environment talking about this whole concept, and how some people really got it and how other people were like, wow, when they got the script, they were like, God, we just don't know what's going to happen next. But everyone really gelled with it, and it does ask some questions. I think it really provokes some fundamental questions, and some uncomfortable questions that we have about the nature of reality and where we fit in that.
Yeah. So the free will and free want. I found it very useful to listen to Kenny Werner, who wrote a book, Effortless Mastery. And he talks about freedom outside of the form and freedom within form. So something like free jazz music, in truest sense of free jazz does not have any rules, like anything goes. But then something like classical music, J.S. Bach, is very mathematical. It's based on few
Very
rules that
technical, yeah.
generate many, many symphonies that all effectively sound the same in some sense because they're all in that style, Baroque and so on. So there is the beauty of performing both within the rules, within structure, within form, and performing outside of the form. And both can be equally challenging to handle. Sometimes people have had these kind of mental breakthroughs. They're sometimes described as breakdowns, but they're breakthroughs often, and they kind of get lost in space, quite literally, because now they realize, oh, I am free in an absolute sense, but what now? Like, who am I in that absolute freedom? And the answer is somewhat like, I'm both nothing and everything, which what Ken Wilber described as I amness before the Big Bang.
Yeah.
Which is also kind of considered as what they call pre-trans fallacy. In other words, before we were aware enough, we used to project these kind of horoscopes and scorpions into the sky and go, oh, look, that cluster there is scorpion, that cluster is fish, and so on, because these are the animals that we saw on the ground, and we sort of just projected it into the sky. We have this tendency to project our pre-rational mind into the trans-rational realm and go, in the trans-rational, there is fish and scorpions and all that kind of stuff. Whereas it's really, we're just taking our kind of primitive mind and kind of amping it up. But so there's, in my view, there's both, you have free will within form of human body, but you are also free to be whoever you want to be. And the role of AI and all this technology is trying to guide us up to that absolute freedom, some way or form or shape. And the wellness and well-being and various kind of coaching tools and SaaS products are all about that kind of, hey, we've been here before, let's pull you up there. It's an interesting thing to think about. And I often sometimes pose this question. Let's pose it to you. What is the world going to be like when we're all fully enlightened?
That's a big question. I suppose it depends on how you define enlightened. First of all.
Okay, so how do you define enlightened?
For me personally, enlightenment is illumination of the darkest areas of myself. Okay. The areas that have kept me stuck or sick or repeating negative cycles. It's really like when those, for me, over the last 12 months, that's what it's become. I feel like I've really come into my own. I feel like in Katona Yoga, we talk about, Katona Yoga, the theory is based around the tiptoe square, the magic square in Chinese medicine, where the template for the body is a house. There's 3 floors, 9 rooms, all add up to 15. So we've got this whole geometry, mathematics, and magic going on. But 3 floors, 3 levels, basement, the lower part of ourselves, the 2nd floor, which is the trunk, the torso, and the 3rd floor, which is the brain, neurology. And it's very interesting because going back to what you just touched on, I agree and disagree, but this is only my take on it, and I'll tell you why. And this is coming from studying mechanical movement and neuroscience, how we move, like the scientific side, and what I've learned from the holistic side. Okay, so what I see it as is that when we look at yoga or when we look at holistic practices like meditation, we're trying to practice a technique. So the technique gives us the illumination. And the more you repeat a technique, the better you get at it, right? The more insight and illumination you get. But there comes a point when we have to be aware of when we're just repeating something for the sake of repeating something, and when that it has served its purpose, and we realize that we need to learn new skills. And that goes to our primitive nature, our first nature, our second nature, our lunar and our solar side. We talk a lot about that in Katona yoga, but that's another conversation for another time. What I see it is, and again, this is just a personal perspective, is that this shell is a containment. We're contained within the physical shell. Yoga gives us the ability to learn discipline if we are prone to not being very disciplined with ourselves, by creating these shapes, these angles. You know, we learn how to recenter ourselves, how to reorganize ourselves, to try and fit ourselves into the center of ourselves, to fit ourselves in the center of these structures. So yoga is a discipline. We're in a containment. But the other side of yoga is that practices like meditation practices and Kriya's cleansing techniques and visualizations and positive psychology and all of loads more stuff give us pockets of space within that confinement where we don't feel that we are confined. So it's like when someone says, oh, you can just shut off your, you know, any teacher that says close your mind in meditation obviously does not understand or is trained properly in meditation. Meditation is not about shutting out anything. It's about the realization of letting things come in, not getting attached and letting them go. That's and in Taoism meditation, it's just sit there and think about, sit there and think about nothing. And if something comes in, that's fine, but don't worry about your posture. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about that. You don't have to be a perfect meditator. Taoism is just very basic. It's just like anyone can do it. I think that's why I really love the beauty of Taoism. So I think that we are confined. I think the brain, neurology, that instigates movement. That the brain is there to direct movement. Movement is the only way that we have to connect with the natural world. It's the only way. Movement, I'm moving here talking to you. So if I didn't have any aspect of movement, I wouldn't be able to communicate through sign language or speech. So movement in a sense of not, stretching and working out, but movement in your eyes, movement in your ears, all these neurological things. The brain instigates movement, and movement is a way to navigate the world. What that world looks like depends on our vision of what we think we see, our vision that is being constructed through our neurons and what's going on in the back of our brain. So again, that's why everybody's reality is why, someone might ask you and me the same thing and we'll come up with different answers of what we can see. It's just the way that we're wired. So we are wired to a degree. Our DNA is a wiring of sorts. Our DNA is a code. Our epigenetics is a code. So we are coded beings. But I guess going back to what you were saying, the difference is we are code, we are patterns. In Chinese medicine, they believe that you can see the whole pattern of your body and your life in your palm. So again, we come back to patterns and codes. The patterns on a leaf, are significant. So we've got all these patterns externally and internally. But the difference is that for humans, for the time being, we like to feel that we have a degree of free will and consciousness, which obviously AIs at the moment don't have. But it is something that anyone you talk to is working on. Emotions, empathy, it's a whole, that is where we're going. We might not get there in my lifetime or your lifetime, but nevertheless, that is the trend. You only need to go to the Japanese robotics companies and look at their expos. They've got AI Buddhist, they've got AIs dressed up in Buddhist clothes, doing a meditation or a wedding or a funeral. So, you know, we've already got this stuff going on. If you look to the American other side of development, you've got sex dolls in AI. They're creating AI sex dolls that are going for about $80,000 or $90,000. So it's, you know, there's all of this stuff that some people might not be even aware of, but it's going on already, you know. And what does that say? That you have to have an AI sex doll, you know, because what, you don't want to actually physically have a communion with another physical human being. You know, I think we have to, and it circles back to how technology has affected us through COVID. You know, yeah, we do need technology, but we have to keep coming back to why, what technology do we need and why do we need it? And my concern is, and I've already had clients say this to me, is that, you know, now we're coming out of, hopefully we're coming out of the isolation, the incubation period. Again, it's going to be quite an adjustment for people to be in people's physical spaces and be really honest with people face to face. You know, hopefully we'll get to a point where we can touch each other again. But, you know, we've become, the last 11, 12 weeks, we've become accustomed to having to behave almost like an AI. We're having to behave on technology, through technology, to have connections. Mm-hmm. You know, so again, that's thrown up a lot of behavioral patterns for some people. Maybe they see things a lot clearly through interaction because they feel more safe to communicate their feelings through a screen than they would if they were actually in person. So I think in person with the person. So I think coming out the other side of this virus, the interactions between people will become very different because the landscape changed. You know, shopping has changed, banking has changed, you know, retail has changed, going out has changed. You know, it's all changed, you know, and things will never go back to how they were quite before COVID. But we were always going the way that we were going pre-COVID anyway, with the escalation of technology. And our fascination with yoga, spirituality, meditation, the brain, mental health, lifestyle, wellness, they were all already evolving and getting more popular, but they've just increased in popularity or significance due to what everyone has experienced through this virus.
Yeah, so one of the things I've spoken to people before about is that we used to meet each other face to face, physically, and then eventually with emergence of technology, we would go through a process of maybe meeting someone physically, then connecting with them digitally and keeping a relationship going that way too. But now it's flipped around where we mostly, like you and I, have met digitally, and we may or may not meet physically. So this interaction is like our avatars are interacting. Who knows if we're ever going to touch, you know, our hands?
Exactly,
Are we ever going to shake hands? I don't know. But yet we are interacting. And so that's a big shift. It's like a black mirror image of the situation. The things that used to be first are now last, if at all, right? And vice versa. Things that used to be an optional connection and digital, now it's like so many people have reached out to me. I've been putting out content for decades online. And now that the lockdown has happened, people are like, Jason, what mic are you using? What camera are you using? How do you do this? Well, how do I even overcome my stuckness that I'm like, feel, you know, ashamed of speaking on camera? It feels weird. You know, it's like, yeah, it's like, well, you know, you want a fast track through something that's effectively taken me 20 years of conditioning and reconditioning myself, but not actually throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because I still love to meet people physically, serendipitously, right? And I'm open to that, you know. So it's an interesting thing that you mentioned, that enlightenment is, and I want to bring you back to that question. You're not going to get away with this. Enlightenment basically being the idea that as you drop the weights of your trauma, stuckness, what we call mental impurities in Fresh Mind program, which is all about psychosocial clearing of everything that's not working, the outdated programming. As you drop the weights, you become lighter and you rise up in your self-awareness and ability to accept new codes, new programming, greater level of freedom. What does the world look like when we are all enlightened?
I don't know. I personally, from a sociology perspective, I don't think that will ever happen. The reason I'm saying that is because we are individual, and because there are so many of us in the world, and we all progress at different rates. I think, that question, I could probably give you an answer to that question if we were part AI and part human. We could probably answer that question. But I think there will always be, I think we're moving from the minority to the majority of people becoming more enlightened or illuminated or more aware, whatever you want to paraphrase it as. But I think there will always, in a humanistic society, there will always be a minority of the population that are not going to that level. What would it look like if everybody was at that level? I guess it would look a lot more, the world would be a more understanding, compassionate, bigger, more creative, inspiring place. I think when people drop the fear, which manifests as greed, manifests as ego, or when we drop the competition and we start to understand that, we all have a bit of competitive nature within us, That's why some people are leaders and other people are not. That's why some people like you and me can speak visually or speak audibly, and I don't have an issue with that. But for a lot of people, that is very difficult to do. It's just they're not comfortable with putting themselves out there. So I think in society, you're always going to have, we talk about this in Katoni, we talk about this in Taoism as the hero's journey and the saint's journey. And the hero's journey is those people, which is signified by what elements you are in Chinese medicine. Fire and wood have this ability to be the lead, to be the warrior, which I had a past life session done on me a few years ago, and I was told that I was on the hero's journey. I was a warrior, fight for truth and justice, but I had to balance that with compassion, because in one of my past lives, I died on the battlefield trying to protect and save everybody else, but I was very lonely. And I found relationships very difficult, and actually that made a huge amount of sense to me. It just showed me where I had a lot of imbalance in my life, where it's important. Illumination, this goes back to your question. I think illumination or enlightenment is the ability to understand what balance really means, and what you value about life, the preciousness of life. What is it that you value? The benefits that you can have from hopefully doing enjoyable work and earning an income, but balancing that with other skills and other hobbies like gardening, cooking, rowing, swimming, tennis, sword fighting, whatever you want to do,
Fishing.
And that's been my illumination, because when I moved the end of last year, I said that if I was going to make a move, thankfully it's before COVID-19, I wanted a complete lifestyle change. I was at a point where I had let go of all the traumas to a degree, where I felt a lot lighter, and I was ready to paint a different narrative on my chalkboard. And so if I was going to move, it was going to have to be a major lifestyle change. So that's why I moved up here onto the water in my lovely floating lodge in Cambridgeshire. And I knew that was, I just instinctively, everything just worked out the way that it was meant to work out. I was meant to get this place when I was meant to get it. I'm surrounded by water, nature. It's brought out the more creative side of me. It's brought out a great appreciation of nature, of gardening, of spending quality time with people, you know, before COVID-19, and focusing, being able to have a very well balanced life that takes in all of my interests and my passions, and being able to live a more simplified life in a way, but one that is truer to who I am, rather than trying to compete with everybody else, trying to be on social media all the time, trying to be doing this, trying to be doing that. I'm just like, no, actually, this is what I feel I need to be doing now. This is what I'm going to do. If I don't want to post on social media for 4 days, then I won't. You know, I only post when I feel I have something fun or educational or relative to say that will hopefully inspire other people. And so I think illumination or enlightenment is coming to an understanding of accepting who you are, who you were, who you're becoming, and that there's no shame in who you want to become. And to me, that's what enlightenment personally means. And that is the path, that is the trajectory that I feel that I am well and truly now on. If all of that sort of hopefully answers the question that you put me on the hook with.
Yes, I think that's a perfect way to just kind of wrap up this segment. I do feel like we will have to speak for another maybe bunch of episodes. So let's just close it off at this point. Just tell the listeners and viewers where they can find more about you, and what is it that you're looking for the most, like make that manifestation into the AI space.
In the AI space.
Yeah.
So my website is lifestyleguruonthewater.com. There's links on the homepage where you can find the more business, professional, scientific, academic side on LinkedIn. Then there's my Instagram and my Twitter feed as well. On the homepage, there's a lot more information about the book, about my background, why I'm writing the book, the aspects of the book, you know, aspects that I'll be covering in the book, which is being tweaked and constantly being retweaking at the moment with COVID. And really, in summary, it's the whole part of what I'm about is about the nature and the future of life and work. And the naturalistic side is looking at the holistic side, is the more basic side of human conditioning. And the future of life and work is more the psychology and the neurology and the technology. And I think that sort of sums it up, really. I hope that sums it up. My main focus is really trying to find the right publishing house, the right traditional publisher, and the editor. So I'm releasing little extracts from my books. There's a few blogs on there as well. But you can enter into, I post a lot of things on LinkedIn on AI and technology, so you can always interact. And we also actually have a space called Safe Space International on LinkedIn, which is an accumulation of forward-thinking people from all different realms of life, because the project that we're working on, Project Steering Wheel, which is the next programming aspect of the next generation of chatbots that's going to sit between clients, patients, and psychiatrists and doctors. We have a whole LinkedIn page, so you can put your thoughts on there. We put articles on there. There's a little bit more about the Project Steering Wheel, which is being retweaked at the moment, which we're working on behind the scenes, but we're still getting funding from governments, and we have private investors also engaged with LVS AI, which is the name of the company. So you know, if you want to join a collection of forward thinkers, and you're not a technophobe, and you realize the reality that AI and technology ain't going anywhere soon, and that we're, you know, the whole purpose of writing the book really is to try and enable people to understand how they can better consciously coexist with technology. And that's the main reason that I wrote the book.
Fantastic. Salema, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate and respect you. And I'm so glad that I'm trying to even remember now how we connected on Facebook and
I
what
think
got
we
us.
connected through our book writing group, didn't we?
Okay. Yeah.
I think we connected first on there, and then we had a dialogue,
Hmm.
less Facebook, through
Yeah.
Facebook, and then we were
Yeah.
just exchanging
Yeah.
ideas and likes and comments. So, that's the good side of technology sometimes,
Yes.
unexpected
Mm.
connections,
Yeah.
manifest.
Exactly. And that serendipity is real, and it's really guiding us to really the next level of self. And that's so beautiful. And I love the journey, and I really respect, love, and appreciate everything that you said. Let's do another episode soon, because there's so many other questions that have sprung up, and time has caught up with us. So thank you very
Yes,
much, and all the best.
you're welcome.